The fuel problem Hitler couldn't hide by late 1944. Germany's armies were bleeding on every front. In the east, the Red Army was pushing toward the Oder. In the west, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and stood on the German border. Hitler still believed he could split the Western Allies with one more surprise offensive. The idea behind the Ardennes attack was simple and ruthless. Smash through what German intelligence saw as a quiet American sector rush fast armored columns to the Meuse River, capture key bridges, drive on Antwerp, and cut British and American armies in half. But there was a problem no speech could fix. Fuel. German synthetic fuel plants had been hammered by Allied bombing. Stocks were low. Many panzer units trained on wooden markups or limited driving time to save fuel. To launch the Ardennes offensive at all, Hitler's staff had to scrape together every drop of gasoline they could find. Even then, it was not enough. The entire plan relied on capturing American fuel along the way. Those neat arrows on the map only worked if U.S. depots were seized intact. That is where Joachim Peiper and his Kampfgruppe came in. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the sharpest spear with an empty tank. Peiper's force tanks, half-tracks, assault guns, engineers, artillery, and a long tail of trucks was the armored spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division. It was given the most direct route toward the Meuse, narrow roads through Belgian villages, and dense forest. On paper, it looked terrifying. Tiger II heavy tanks, Panthers, and experienced crews. In reality, the column set off with barely enough fuel for the first phases of the advance. Every kilometer eaten by their engines narrowed the margin for success. Every detour, traffic jam, or skirmish burned precious gasoline that could never be replaced from Germany. Yet on the first days of the offensive, fortune seemed to smile on Peiper. The Miracle Depot. 50,000 gallons of enemy fuel near the town of Bulge. Peiper's column overran a large American supply point that had been hastily abandoned. Inside stood rows of fuel trucks and storage tanks. 50,000 gallons of U.S. gasoline, more than his Kampfgruppe had dared hope for. To Panzer crews running on fumes, it looked like salvation. Tanks and half-tracks were refueled, captured. American vehicles were pressed into service. Officers believed they now had the range to smash deep into Allied territory, but the Miracle Depot came with a price that became clear only later. First, time. Moving fuel from the depot into German vehicles took hours. The schedule did not really have. Every hour lost allowed American engineers to blow more bridges, move reserves, and thicken roadblocks. Second, weight and complexity. The more fuel and vehicles Peiper picked up, the longer and more fragile his column became. Captured trucks and tankers had to be shepherded along narrow, icy roads. A spearhead designed for shock suddenly dragged a vulnerable logistics tail behind it. Third, false confidence. Full tanks. An easy plunder encouraged Peiper to push ahead even farther from the rest of 6th Panzer Army. Instead of falling back to a more realistic line when resistance stiffened, he kept driving into a maze of bad roads and converging American units. The free fuel allowed him to go deeper. It did not change the fact that Germany had no secure way to keep those tanks supplied once the initial surprise faded. American reaction. Blowing bridges and squeezing the spear, the U.S. command responded quickly. Engineers destroyed bridges and choked key crossroads with roadblocks and wrecks. Tank destroyer units and infantry held towns long enough to slow the German timetable. By the time Peiper's tanks approached places like Stoumont and Gleize, they were fighting for every meter. American artillery hammered the roads. Fighter bombers pounced whenever the weather briefly cleared. Instead of racing through open country, the elite panzer force found itself boxed into narrow valleys and villages, with enemy units forming on its flanks and rear. Each engagement meant more burned fuel, more damaged vehicles, and more delays. The 1 gallons from Bulge turned out to be just enough to drive Peiper into a pocket he could not escape with his armor. Snow, empty tanks, and the long walk home by late December. Kampfgruppe Peiper was effectively surrounded near Gleize. American units had closed off the key roads. Supplies could not reach them. Airstrikes and artillery made movement by day nearly impossible. Peiper faced an ugly choice: stay with his tanks and be crushed, or abandon the vehicles, slip out on foot through the forest, and save as many men as possible. He chose the second option. German troops sabotaged what they could, left tanks and half-tracks where they stood, and marched back through the snow, carrying only what they could handle. The elite Panzer Spearhead that had set off with such confidence, fed by a miracle of captured American fuel, now ended the campaign walking home. For the overall German offensive, the loss of Peiper's Kampfgruppe as an effective armored force was a major blow. The timetable collapsed. Other units, also starved of fuel, failed to reach their objectives. Within weeks, the Bulge shrank and disappeared. Why the free fuel doomed them? On the surface, 50,000 gallons of high-octane gasoline looked like a gift. In reality, it exposed the deeper problems of Hitler's war. Logistics over glamour. German strategy still revolved around bold arrows and elite units, but the industrial and fuel base to support them had rotted away. Overextension. The extra fuel encouraged a deeper, riskier advance without a secure supply line behind it. It let Peiper drive just far enough to be cut off and destroyed as a fighting force. Time as a weapon, the delay spent refueling gave the Americans exactly what they needed. Time to organize defenses, blow bridges, and bring in artillery and armor. Illusion of strength. Captured fuel masked the reality that Germany could not sustain modern mechanized warfare against a fully mobilized United States and its allies. In a sense, the depot at Bulge did doom Hitler's elite Panzer Spearhead, but only because the offensive was already balanced on a knife edge of fuel and fantasy. The gasoline let them move farther than their own logistics could support, straight into a trap created by geography, weather, and Allied reaction. The men who found that free fuel thought they had been handed victory. History shows they had really been handed just enough range to reach the end of the road.